3 nations died in perfect order: Jamaica, Cuba, Bahamas. 48 hours, 1 killer. October 28th, 2025. Hurricane Melissa began executing what forensic disaster analysts are calling the most systematic regional murder in recorded hurricane history. Not random destruction, calculated assassination of an entire geographic area through coordinated multinational killing. Forensic meteorologist Dr. Sandra Gutierrez studied Melissa's path like a crime scene investigator examining a serial killer's methodology. Each nation was systematically destroyed, using its collapse to amplify the killing of the next target. First, Jamaica was hit by 185 miles per hour winds that surgically eliminated emergency response infrastructure, leaving the island helpless and creating communication blackouts that blinded subsequent victims. Next, Cuba suffered a Category 3 impact that forced 735,000 evacuations, while Jamaica's destroyed systems prevented coordination, amplifying chaos and refugee overflow toward the final target. Finally, the Bahamas were struck by a Category 1 impact against a nation already overwhelmed by refugee overflow and emergency system collapse triggered by the previous 2 strikes. Gutierrez realized she was documenting the first regional serial killing by a weather system where climate-amplified hurricanes demonstrate systematic killing capabilities that use each victim's collapse to enable the killing of subsequent targets. The investigation revealed that Melissa's methodology followed calculated protocols. First, eliminate communication, then create refugee chaos to overwhelm remaining victims, and finally strike weakened targets through systematic regional termination. The most chilling discovery was that Melissa's techniques are replicable. Future mega-hurricanes could follow identical killing protocols, using the same systematic approach to destroy entire regions through coordinated multinational murder sequences. Forensic analysis confirms that climate change is not just creating destructive storms. It is producing serial killer hurricanes and capable of systematic regional murder through coordinated assassination protocols. That raises a haunting question for investigators. If Melissa could systematically murder 3 nations in 48 hours through coordinated killing techniques, what happens when the next serial killer hurricane targets regions with even more potential victims? Are we entering an era where hurricanes do not just destroy, they systematically murder entire regions through calculated assassination protocols? Dr. Sandra Gutierrez, lead forensic meteorologist for the International Hurricane Investigative Unit, approaches megastorms like Melissa as crime scenes. We are not just analysing physical damage patterns anymore. We are profiling hurricane behaviour as calculated, almost intelligent. Melissa did not just ravage the Caribbean randomly, it executed a series of murders with terrifying precision. Colonel Patricia Santos, military disaster analyst and co-lead investigator, explains why Melissa marks a disturbing evolution of hurricane threat capability. Most hurricanes weaken rapidly after landfall. They are designed for single-target destruction, but Melissa maintained lethal intensity across 3 nations in sequence. That is, serial killer behaviour, not standard storm deterioration. Historically, even the most catastrophic Atlantic hurricanes have been solitary actors. They make landfall, unleash maximum damage on a single target, then rapidly weaken as they move further inland. The deadliest storm in Atlantic history, the Great Hurricane of 1780, killed 22,000 people, and the vast majority of deaths occurred on a single island, Barbados. After ravaging that initial target, the storm lost killing capacity. In sharp contrast, Melissa executed a tightly coordinated 3-target kill sequence with unnatural efficiency, striking Jamaica as a Category 5, Cuba as a Category 3, and the Bahamas as a still lethal Category 1, all while maintaining near maximum killing capacity. To put Melissa's systematic lethality in perspective, consider Hurricane Dorian and its impact on the Bahamas in 2019. Dorian made landfall with 185 miles per hour winds, identical to Melissa's Jamaica strike. But after decimating the Bahamas, Dorian weakened to a post-tropical storm before reaching Canada. Melissa's ability to sustain Category 1 intensity on its third regional target over 48 hours after initial landfall defies every historical precedent and projection model. Its lethal efficiency across multiple targets was not just record-breaking. Dr. Gutierrez called it homicidal. But to understand the full scale of Melissa's killing capacity, analysts needed to go beyond traditional metrics of wind speed and pressure and examine the storm as the work of a calculating, coordinated killer. Colonel Santos walks through the chilling interconnections of Melissa's regional assassination sequence. This was a kill chain designed for maximum damage amplification. Every murder was not just vicious on its own, but deliberately set up the next target for even more devastating elimination. The systematic nature of the attacks unfolds with disturbing intention. Jamaica, the first victim, was not just battered with Category 5 winds. Melissa surgically eliminated the nation's communication infrastructure with almost sadistic precision. Cellular networks, radio towers, satellite uplinks were strategically crippled in the first 6 hours of landfall. The result was a communications blackout that did not just isolate Jamaica in its moment of crisis, it blinded regional partners to the totality of destruction. That communications murder set the stage for Cuba's killing. When Melissa made Category 3 impact 24 hours after Jamaica's last transmission, Cuban emergency systems were already compromised by an inability to coordinate with their incapacitated neighbour. The resulting evacuation chaos, 735,000 displaced in a matter of hours, was not just a product of Cuba's own infrastructure damage. It was a mathematically inevitable result of Jamaica's communications collapse, triggering regional emergency system failures. And those dual murders created a doubly impossible scenario for Melissa's final target. By the time the storm reached the Bahamas, it was not just striking a nation with first-degree hurricane damage, it was facing a country already drowning in a two-pronged disaster. Jamaica and Cuba's communication deaths had amplified into a tripled refugee crisis, with evacuees from 3 nations overwhelming every Bahamian emergency resource. When Melissa made its Category 1 landfall, the islands were already in the throes of systemic collapse. The final death toll reflects the horrifying effectiveness of Melissa's murder coordination. While Jamaica suffered the highest direct casualties from Melissa's Category 5 impact, the Bahamas and Cuba experienced greater total systemic deaths due to the storm's engineered regional collapse. Put simply, Melissa transformed the entire Caribbean into a chain of homicidal dominoes. Each island's destruction became a trigger for the next target's amplified devastation. And the end result was a region-wide death toll that far exceeded the sum of Melissa's categorized parts. To map the full scale of Melissa's serial assassination, a joint international task force led by Dr. Gutierrez and Colonel Santos conducted a first-of-its-kind forensic hurricane reconstruction. The results read like a cross between a disaster movie and a crime scene report. The analysis begins by identifying Melissa's murder weapons: wind speed, communications blackouts, infrastructure collapse, refugee overflow. Each was deadly on its own, but deployed in a combination that turns the Caribbean's geography against itself. Jamaica, the first victim, is a case study in homicidal overkill. Melissa's Category 5 winds did not just destroy 90% of the island's structures, they took special aim at roads, bridges, power plants, the connective tissue that might have enabled regional rescue efforts. When Cuba and the Bahamas lost contact with Jamaica 6 hours into the storm, they were not just blind to their neighbours' status. They were strategically cut off from any chance of coordinating evacuation or relief plans, leaving them even more vulnerable to Melissa's next moves. That's when the kill chain turns Cuba's own defences into deadly liabilities. The nation's emergency protocols designed for single storm response buckle under the weight of Jamaica's invisible collapse. Evacuation routes become traps, and shelters become dead ends. By the time Melissa finishes with its second victim, the two most populated and resourced islands in the Caribbean have been transformed into twin hubs of murderous chaos, pumping out hundreds of thousands of refugees into a region with no remaining cruise capacity to absorb them. The Bahamas, already strained by decades of rising seas and intensifying storms, takes Melissa's killing blows not as a standalone disaster, but as the last link in a regional chain of destruction. When the outer bands make landfall, the islands are already on life support. The final death toll defies prediction models and historical precedent. There were over 60 direct casualties. This left 750,000 people displaced across 3 nations, and a region-wide infrastructure collapse rendered the very concept of recovery impossible. But the grimmest figure of all may be the one that comes next. Melissa's systematic regional assassination did not just create a record-breaking body count, it established a replicable pattern for future storms to follow. In the words of Dr. Gutierrez, Melissa was a proof of concept, a demonstration that climate-amplified hurricanes can turn a region's own geography into a series of kill switches. And now that we have seen that murder methodology in action, we have to assume it will happen again. In the aftermath of Melissa's 3-nation crime spree, a grim calculus is taking shape in disaster labs worldwide. Call it criminal profiling for killer storms, identifying the signatures of homicidal intent in intensifying hurricane patterns. The early results are sobering. Melissa's systematic communications takedown, once an outlier nightmare scenario, is already being replicated by subsequent storms. 2026's Hurricane Omar crippled Puerto Rico's satellite network 12 hours before landfall, amplifying the chaos to come. Evacuation protocols, long designed for single storm surges, are showing critical failures in the face of Melissa-style multi-island attacks. When 2027's Tropical Storm Rebecca overwhelmed Hispaniola's shelters, the resulting refugee overflow nearly collapsed relief efforts in the Turks and Caicos. Perhaps most alarming of all, the cold, hard math of climate physics guarantees that Melissa-scale killing potential will only grow. As ocean temperatures rise and storm intensification accelerates, the number of hurricane threesomes capable of Caribbean-wide destruction is set to double by 2030. In other words, Melissa was just the first installment in a pattern of region-wide threat multiplication, an inaugural demonstration of how warming seas and intensifying storms can transform hurricane zones from disaster risks to geographic murder hazards. Traditionally, hurricane disaster planning has relied on a simple principle: resilient neighbours. A web of regional partnerships designed to absorb and distribute the shock of a major storm beyond ground zero. Melissa's legacy is the systematic dismantling of that life-saving network. When a storm can maintain kill-scale power across multiple targets, every island becomes its neighbour's liability instead of its lifeline. And that math, combined with the raw physics of climate change, yields a horrifying forecast for hurricane-prone regions worldwide. More Melissas are not just possible, they are inevitable. A new breed of nomadic serial killer born in warming seas, perfecting its lethal craft with each landfall. And the traditional tools of hurricane defense, from evacuation protocols to recovery partnerships, are already being turned into the triggers of their own unraveling. Melissa's systematic execution of the Caribbean was a regional death sentence, but in the eyes of global disaster analysts, it was also a global warming crime scene. A fingerprint of fatal physics, derived from decades of rising temperatures, sketched in blood across 3 coastlines. Melissa was not an accident of nature. It was the inevitable offspring of a climate system tipping into a lethal new equilibrium, one in which hurricanes are no longer just hazards, but homicides in waiting. And the implications extend far beyond the Caribbean. The same storm boosting forces that enabled Melissa's 3-target kill chain are building in cyclone alleys worldwide. Consider the Bay of Bengal, where 500,000 people perished in a single 1970 storm. Consider the Gulf of Mexico, where Hurricane Katrina rewrote American history. Consider the West Pacific, already the most hurricane-prone basin on Earth. In each of these geographies, a common threat profile is taking shape. Rising seas, providing more lethal fuel for landfalling storms. Accelerating intensification rates, allowing hurricanes to maintain murderous strength across wider target zones. And sprawling multinational coastlines, ripe for Melissa-style chain reaction catastrophes. Melissa was a window into this gathering threat, a regional death sentence and a global warning shot. The first in a new breed of roaming killers, born in human-warmed oceans, drunk on our carbon emissions, and determined to turn our coastlines against us. In the meteorological ledgers, it will be remembered as the first hurricane to systematically execute an entire region. In the courts of global climate justice, it deserves to be indicted as a crime against geography itself, a homicidal offspring of our warming world and a harbinger of the multi-victim massacres to come. There is no bringing back the 60 lives Melissa claimed, no rebuilding for the 750,000 it displaced across 3 nations. And for the millions more in its path, there is no return to a world in which hurricanes are just hazards, not hardened killers stalking them from the rising seas. But there is still time to learn from its lethal legacy, to name its crimes, not as isolated acts of nature, but as the inevitable offspring of a world we have warmed, to recognize its systematic destruction, not as an accident, but as a template for the murderous math of all the Melissas to come. Most of all, there is still time to recognize Melissa for what it truly was. Not just a record-breaking storm or a regional catastrophe, but a global crime scene. A mass murder made possible by our collective climate transgressions, and a warning of the homicidal physics ahead. This is Earth Attacks, where we expose the criminal calculus of a warming world, one killer storm at a time. Hit that subscribe button because the next Melissa is always just one landfall away. And none of us can afford to look away from the blood on our rising tides.